They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But what happens when the road to financial ruin is paved with outright theft? They've spent decades watching European politicians make catastrophic decisions, but what I'm about to reveal makes even the euro crisis look like a minor accounting error. Over the past few weeks, a plan has been quietly gestating in Brussels that would make even the most brazen kleptocrat blush. The European Commission wants to steal 140 billion euros of Russian assets, not freeze them, not hold them as leverage, steal them outright, and they're trying to dress this up as some sort of moral crusade. Now, I realize that's a strong word, theft, but what else would you call it when you take someone else's money without their consent and without legal justification? When I was a correspondent in Moscow during the Soviet collapse, I witnessed the wholesale looting of state assets. The methods were different, but the fundamental principle was the same: might makes right. But here's what they don't want you to know. This isn't just about Russia anymore. It's about the complete breakdown of international law, and it's about to backfire spectacularly. I've been following European politics since the common market days, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, I have never seen such a dangerous combination of legal illiteracy and economic desperation as what we're witnessing right now in Brussels. And the country standing in their way, Belgium of all places. Now, you might ask yourself why Belgium matters. After all, this is a country most people couldn't locate on a map if their lives depended on it. But here's the crucial detail that changes everything. Belgium hosts Euroclear, the central securities depository that actually holds most of these Russian assets. Without Belgium's cooperation, this entire scheme collapses, and Belgium is saying no. But before we delve into this extraordinary standoff, let me take you back to how we arrived at this moment. Because what's happening now didn't emerge in a vacuum. It's the logical conclusion of 3 years of economic warfare that has done more damage to Europe than to Russia. When the EU first imposed sanctions on Russia in February 2022, the rhetoric was clear. These were temporary measures designed to bring Moscow to its knees. Within months, the European Commission, President Ursula von der Leyen, confidently predicted that Russia's economy would collapse by Christmas. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke of isolating Putin's regime from the global financial system. 3 years later, the Russian economy is growing at 4% annually, while Germany has entered recession. Russian export revenues have diversified away from Europe and toward Asia. Putin's approval ratings remain sky high. Meanwhile, European energy costs have tripled, industrial production is plummeting, and Brussels is desperately searching for new revenue streams to keep Ukraine funded. The irony is staggering. Germany, which once prided itself on industrial efficiency and fiscal responsibility, now finds itself deindustrializing at an alarming rate. Major chemical companies are shutting down German operations and moving to the United States, where energy is cheaper. BASF, the chemical giant that was once the backbone of German industry, has announced massive layoffs. The Mittelstand, those medium-sized family businesses that made Germany an export powerhouse, are going bankrupt at unprecedented rates. This is where our story truly begins, because what we're witnessing now isn't strength, it's the financial panic of a failing strategy. Here's what actually happened behind closed doors. The European Commission calculated that without this 40 billion euro injection, Ukraine's defense budget would collapse within 6 months. They couldn't admit this publicly, of course, because it would expose the fundamental failure of their entire sanctions regime. So instead, they decided to change the rules of international finance. The plan is breathtakingly simple in its cynicism. They want to use frozen Russian central bank assets as collateral for a massive loan to Ukraine. But there's a problem. Using someone else's money as collateral for your own borrowing isn't legal under international law. It's theft, dressed up in bureaucratic language. And here's where it gets really interesting. The European Commission has spent months trying to construct a legal justification for this scheme. They've hired expensive lawyers, they've created complex financial instruments, they've invented new interpretations of existing treaties, but every single legal opinion comes to the same conclusion: this would be illegal under international law. That's why Belgium is refusing to cooperate. Belgian officials understand that if this scheme goes forward and international courts rule against it, which they almost certainly will, Belgium would be liable for massive damages. We're potentially talking about hundreds of billions in compensation claims. But there's more to Belgium's resistance than just financial self-interest. Belgian legal scholars have been quietly circulating papers explaining why this asset seizure would violate multiple international treaties. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the International Court of Justice statute, basic principles of sovereign immunity, all would be trampled underfoot by this scheme. One prominent Belgian constitutional lawyer told me privately that proceeding with this plan would be the most serious violation of international law since the Iraq invasion. But here's what makes Belgium's position even more significant. Other European governments privately agree with them. France and Italy have both expressed serious reservations about the legal risks. Slovakia and Hungary have flatly refused to participate. Even Germany's constitutional court has raised concerns about the scheme's legality. Yet despite all this opposition, despite the legal risks, despite the obvious dangers to the international financial system, Brussels keeps pushing forward. Why? Because they're trapped by their own propaganda. For 3 years, European politicians have told their voters that sanctions were working, that Russia was isolated, that victory was just around the corner. They can't admit now that this was all fantasy. They can't admit that their strategy has failed so comprehensively that they're now reduced to outright theft to keep their proxy war funded. And this brings us to the most dangerous aspect of this entire affair. Because once you start stealing other countries' assets, once you abandon international law when it becomes inconvenient, you've destroyed the foundation of the entire global financial system. Think about this carefully. If the European institutions can simply seize Russian assets because they disagree with Russian policy, what's to stop China from seizing European assets the next time Brussels criticizes Beijing? What's to stop Saudi Arabia from freezing German investments if Germany votes for another UN resolution about human rights? What's to stop any country from retaliating in kind? The European Commission seems to believe that because they control the moral high ground, at least in their own minds, they can rewrite the rules of international finance. This is precisely the kind of thinking that destroyed the British Empire, the belief that good intentions justify any action, no matter how reckless or illegal. But there's an even more immediate problem. Even if this scheme somehow succeeded legally, it would be an economic disaster for Europe itself. Here's why. Russia holds approximately 260 billion euros in European sovereign debt. If Brussels steals Russian central bank assets, Moscow would be entirely justified in seizing European government bonds of equivalent value. This would trigger a European debt crisis that would make 208 look like a minor market correction. Moreover, this scheme would signal to every non-Western country that European financial institutions cannot be trusted. We're already seeing capital flight from European banks toward Asian alternatives. This theft would accelerate that trend dramatically. China has been quietly building alternative payment systems for years, preparing for exactly this kind of Western overreach. If Europe demonstrates that it will steal assets when politically convenient, Beijing will have all the justification it needs to convince developing countries to abandon European financial institutions entirely. The numbers are already telling the story. Chinese yuan settlements have increased by 300% since 2022. The BRICS payment system is processing billions in transactions monthly. Countries like Saudi Arabia, which historically conducted all oil sales in dollars and euros, are now accepting yuan for significant portions of their exports. Brazil and Argentina have started trading directly in their national currencies, bypassing Western financial systems altogether. This asset seizure scheme would accelerate this trend exponentially, potentially cutting Europe out of global finance within a decade. But perhaps most damaging of all would be the precedent this sets for the future. International law exists not to protect the strong, they can protect themselves, but to protect smaller countries from the arbitrary actions of great powers. If Europe abandons these principles now, it will have no moral authority to complain when China or Russia does the same in future conflicts. This is where Belgium's resistance becomes truly significant. By refusing to cooperate, Brussels is inadvertently saving Europe from itself. because if this scheme went forward, it would mark the beginning of the end of Europe's role in the global financial system. Yet rather than acknowledging these risks, European Commission officials are doubling down. They're now floating alternative funding mechanisms, including the creation of new European bonds backed by collective European debt. This is exactly what countries like France and Italy have wanted for years, a way to make fiscally responsible countries like Germany liable for everyone else's borrowing. The cynicism is breathtaking. They're using the Ukraine crisis as an excuse to fundamentally restructure European finances in ways that would normally be politically impossible. They're exploiting a war to advance their federalist agenda. And here's where the story takes an even more sinister turn, because while Brussels has been focused on this asset seizure scheme, the actual situation in Ukraine has continued to deteriorate rapidly. Latest reports suggest that over 21,000 Ukrainian soldiers deserted in October alone. Major defensive positions are collapsing across multiple fronts. The electricity grid is on the verge of complete failure. I've been following military conflicts for 4 decades, from the Falklands to Iraq to Afghanistan. I recognize the signs of institutional collapse when I see the Ukrainian army as disintegrating, not through dramatic battles, but through the slow hemorrhaging of morale and manpower. Western military advisors are quietly expressing alarm at desertion rates that rival those of the South Vietnamese army in 1975. Yet European politicians continue to speak as if victory is achievable with just a bit more money, a few more weapons, one more financial injection. In other words, even if this 40 billion euro theft succeeded, it would likely arrive too late to change the military outcome. Europe would have destroyed its own financial credibility for nothing. But European leaders can't admit this, because doing so would require acknowledging that their entire strategy has been built on delusions. They convince themselves that sanctions would cripple Russia. They believe that Western military aid would guarantee Ukrainian victory. They assume that Putin would eventually under pressure. None of this happened. Instead, Russia has adapted, Ukraine is losing, and Europe has bankrupted itself pursuing a fantasy. Now, rather than accept reality and negotiate an end to this catastrophe, they're preparing to commit international robbery to keep the fantasy alive a little longer. This is what institutional corruption looks like in practice. Not backroom deals or briefcases full of cash, but the systematic abandonment of legal and moral principles in service of political necessity. European institutions have become so invested in their own propaganda that they're willing to destroy the international system to avoid admitting error. And the most tragic aspect of all this, it's completely unnecessary. There are still diplomatic options available. There are still ways to end this conflict through negotiation rather than escalation. But pursuing those options would require European leaders to admit that their strategy has failed, and this is apparently a psychological impossibility for them. Instead, they prefer to double down, to escalate, to take increasingly desperate and illegal actions rather than face reality. They would rather steal Russian money than negotiate with Russian diplomats. They would rather risk a global financial crisis than admit they were wrong about sanctions. This is how empires end, not with dramatic military defeats, but with the slow erosion of moral authority and the gradual abandonment of the principles that once made them respected. Europe is committing institutional suicide, and most Europeans don't even realize it's happening. I remember covering the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. The parallels are eerie. Then as now, we saw institutions that lost touch with reality, leaders who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, and a systematic abandonment of the principles that had once given the system legitimacy. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of external invasion. It rotted from within, destroyed by its own contradictions and delusions. The European Union is following the same path. It has become so invested in its own mythology, the idea that it represents universal values, that it speaks for civilized humanity, that it can do no wrong, that it has lost the ability to engage with reality. When faced with the failure of its strategy, it doubles down. When confronted with legal obstacles, it simply changes the law. When presented with economic consequences, it prints more money. Because while their politicians debate asset seizures and loan mechanisms, European citizens are dealing with the real consequences of this failed strategy. Energy bills that have tripled, industrial jobs that have disappeared, a standard of living that continues to decline as resources are diverted to fund conflicts that cannot be won. The European Union was supposed to bring prosperity and peace to the continent. Instead, it has brought economic decline and proxy warfare. It was supposed to represent European values on the global stage. Instead, it has become a byword for hypocrisy and legal nihilism. And the most bitter irony, the countries that refuse to participate in this asset seizure scheme, Belgium, Slovakia, Hungary, are the ones actually upholding European legal traditions. They're the ones defending the rule of law against Brussels' authoritarian impulses. Meanwhile, the countries pushing hardest for this theft, Germany, the Netherlands, the Baltic states, are the same ones that lecture others about respect for international law and institutional integrity. The cognitive dissonance is... So where does this leave us? The immediate future is likely to bring escalating confrontation as Brussels tries to find ways around Belgian resistance. We'll probably see new schemes, new legal interpretations, new attempts to justify what is fundamentally unjustifiable. But the longer-term consequences will be far more serious. Europe has already lost much of its credibility as a defender of international law. If this asset seizure somehow proceeds, that credibility will be permanently destroyed. Other countries will remember that Europe abandoned its principles when convenient. They'll remember that European institutions chose theft over negotiation. They'll remember that when faced with the failure of their own strategy, European leaders preferred to break the law rather than admit error. And they'll act accordingly in future crises. The result will be a more fragmented, more dangerous world where might makes right and international law means nothing. This is the real cost of European delusions about Ukraine, not just economic decline or military failure, but the destruction of the international system that has kept the peace for decades, all because European politicians couldn't bear to admit they were wrong. Belgium's resistance offers one last chance to step back from this precipice, one last opportunity to choose principle over propaganda, law over theft, reality over fantasy. But given everything we've seen over the past 3 years, given the institutional corruption and moral blindness that has characterized European policy throughout this crisis, I'm not optimistic that wisdom will prevail. More likely, Brussels will find some way to circumvent Belgian resistance and proceed with this catastrophic scheme. And when the predictable consequences arrive, the legal challenges, the retaliation, the financial crisis, they'll blame everyone except themselves. This is how institutions die, not through external attack, but through internal moral collapse. Europe is destroying itself, one illegal scheme at a time, and apparently nothing can stop it.